I think sometimes the most useful thing that any form of art can do is it engages the imaginative and creative spirit, which is the opposite of despair. So I think the role of a novelist is not very different to the role of any human being. I think the question is how do you engage with the world, uh, given the position you're in, the power you have, the means at your disposal. At any moment, what is the most successful form of engagement? And that will shift, I think, from one moment to the next. The world needs changing, I think. There is the fundamental disbalances that are so vast, and you might say have always been vast. But just because they've always been vast doesn't mean it's okay. I think, and I mean, there are two things that are happening now that make it very hard, I think, even for those of us whose work is the imagination, to imagine the future. And one is the climate catastrophe and the other is ALA. And the possible intersection of the two. I don't know what the world is going to look like in 10 years. I don't know what my profession will look like in all of this. And that is quite scary. With the climate crisis, it's particularly scary because it does feel that so the people who get to make decisions are the worst people we could have in those places right now. There may be imaginative possibilities ahead that we haven't dreamed up. And that crises bring up new solutions, so you sort of hold on to hope. But I'm very scared for the future. It's sort of interesting that sometimes we talk of writers as being prescient and looking ahead, when in fact all they're doing is seeing what already exists and just imagining one step forward. They're not creating things out of nowhere. They're looking at what exists and saying, and what if you add this one element to it? You very rarely have to add 10 elements. You're just adding one element. So I suppose one of the things that it is our job as writers to do is to pay attention to the stories that are building, the things that are still somewhat subterranean. I'm really interested in our relationship to home, depending on the period of time and the stages of our life that we spend somewhere. The first 18 years of my life were entirely lived in Karachi. It meant that I formed a very, very stable sense of home and belonging. And then I went to university in America, and then I came back to Karachi, and then I used to travel a lot. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I actually moved to London. So I had a lot of years, I think, to really feel very secure in this one idea of home. And then to be able to move away from it and bring on other homes. I think, and I'm basing this on the many friends I've had and people I've spoken to, I think if you grow up with a much less stable idea of home, it becomes much more problematic to fix yourself to that word. And that unstable idea of home could be if you are moving different places, but it could also be if you are living in one place as a minority and a good proportion of the majority culture does not recognize you as a citizen of that place or an equal citizen, or thinks that the word home should not define your relationship to this place, even though you grew up there. I mean, I suppose the question is, what is the role of the artist? And does that change as the political moment changes? So I want to start by saying that I get a little queasy sometimes about too large a claim being made for what writers can do. And I think often of an essay by Elaine Castillo in which she's talking about the deep problem in this line that so many people, including me over the years, have come out with, which is novels create empathy. Empathy creates better human beings and better understanding between people. And somehow, if we all read more novels and had more empathy, the world would be better. And she said, if you might say that reading a novel set in a certain war zone would create empathy in the reader for people caught up in that war. And she said, my response to that is, if it requires a novel to make you feel empathy for people in a war zone, you have problems beyond anything that a novel can solve. I think sometimes the most useful thing that any form of art can do is it engages the imaginative and creative spirit, which is the opposite of despair. I can be very despairing, and then I sit down to write, and I find that the process of writing or the process of reading is moving me out of despair, because a different bit of my brain is working, and some new ways of thinking about the world are emerging. So I think novels can partly do that, is activate bits of our brain and stop them from just thinking, oh, it's all hopeless and pointless, and there's no good me thinking about anything, there's nothing else I can do. So there is the creative impulse. I think sometimes people at an individual level are changed by novels. I have been. I have thought differently about certain things. My engagement with Palestine started through poetry, rather than anything else. And so I have felt firsthand the way in which a work of art can move you towards a curiosity you didn't have before, which you then have to build up on. What is our responsibility to a world needs saving? I suppose the first question is the responsibility of a writer any different to the responsibility of a doctor or a plumber or a teacher? I think we all need to accept that we have some responsibility. And then you work from within, from the place you're standing in. So as a novelist, I do what I can. Or ideally, I would do what I can. Of course, I'm always falling short. But I do think the world is very scary right now. And it's interesting, I grew up in Pakistan during the years of the Zia-ul-Haq dictatorship. I have a lot of knowledge of powerlessness, of the feeling that everything around you is bleak, that it isn't changing. When I heard that Zia-ul-Haq had died, there's an aunt who called, and my parents weren't at home, and she said, are your parents there? And I said, no, I was 15 at the time. She said, tell them Zia-ul-Haq is dead. His plane blew up. And I said, okay, and I hung up. And then my parents came home, and about 2 hours later, my mother came running into the room where my father and I were. And she said, Zia's dead. And I said, oh yes, Aunt so-and-so called to say. And my parents even said, why didn't you say anything? And I said, oh, she's always making up stories. I didn't believe it. And it was many, many, many years later, I realized I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it was possible, because my whole life, it just seemed he is always going to be this absolutely tyrannical, dominant figure. So I know what it is to live and grow up with a sense of hopelessness and bleakness. And yet I feel more hopeless and bleak now. And partly it's, when you're 15 or 14 or 13, perhaps you don't think about things in the same way, and the norm is the norm. But I also think that when I was growing up, there were lots of other places in the world you could look to and think the world is better elsewhere. There is this possibility. This is what better looks like. I was 15 when dictatorship ended in Pakistan. The next year, the Berlin Wall came down. Nelson Mandela was freed. I feel so privileged to have been very young in a moment when it felt like the world was getting better. And it felt as though it was an inexorable direction, and we were only going to keep moving further towards better. I'm very grateful to have known that. It was stupendous. It was extraordinary to be young and feel I'm going to grow up in a better world. And I want nothing more for a younger generation than to know that. And they know the opposite. And we need to do what we can, to do anything to create places of hope, so that they can get at least a glimmer of what I was bathed in as a teenager.